Welcome to the Governance Podcast at the Centre for the Study of Governance and Society at King's College London. My name is Irina Schneider and I'm your host. It's my absolute pleasure to welcome Bart Wilson, who is the Donald P. Kennedy Endowed Chair in Economics and Law at Chapman University in Southern California. He has co-authored a forthcoming Cambridge University Press book with Nobel laureate Vernon Smith called Humanomics, Moral Sentiments and the Wealth of Nations for the 21st Century. More recently, he has used experimental economics to explore the foundations of exchange and the origins of property. Bart, it's a pleasure to have you with us today.
Thanks for having me.
Your latest book project tackles a concept that is really central to most of social science, property. And you touch on really deep questions about how we as a human species developed property, how it's changed over time, and how property and ownership are actually a really deep part of who we are as human beings. I'd like to begin with actually just getting the terms right. What is property? Does it differ in your account from what we traditionally think of as property?
So there are two different camps on campus. If you visit the humanities departments, you will hear that property is unique to Western Europeans, and so only a subset of humans have property. Whereas if you travel to the other side of campus and you talk to the biologists, they will tell you that property is ubiquitous in the animal kingdom. You'll see it in dolphins with their prey, with baboons and their harems and the females, with squirrels and their nuts. And so in one part of campus, it's ubiquitous in the animal kingdom, another part, only some humans. I'm a social scientist. I'm going to propose a compromise somewhere in the middle, that property is a universal and uniquely human custom, which will make neither the biologists nor the people in humanities departments happy.
How did you come to that conclusion?
Well, it's been a lot of reading about biology and how biologists think about the problems, and also thinking about what are the critiques. Why is it that there's some pretty strong critiques about property in the Western world? And what did they have in common and what did they not have in common? And how is it that I think social scientists tend to attract from both of those? They will say, oh yes, it's true that the European conquerors, when they came to North America, had property notions that were different than the Native Americans. And at the same time, they'll say, oh, but my dog has property over the bone. It's quite clear. And it's like, okay, so we're adopting some of this. How do we synthesize this? And so thinking about it for me as reading biology helped me get out of my human-centric way of thinking about things and think of us, okay, well, how are we like all these other animals and how we treat things in the world and how are we different? But there seemed to be one key difference. When you talk about animals, when they talk about property, it's always over territory, mates, and food, not really about other things. And that is something about humans, that we have property in our backpacks, we have property in our computers, in our phones, things that are not food, territory, and mates. And the other thing is that in biology, those kind of property-like behaviors don't have to be taught. Wolves don't go around teaching their young how to mark their territory and respect the territory and be careful if you go to this territory. They instinctually go around doing that. So that seems that's passed on genetically. The same thing with having food within your grasp. If another animal's trying to take it out of you, that makes you less fit. So having to teach that could be real problematic for the species. So those things seem to be genetic. And what the humanities scholars would be telling you is that no, property is cultural. It's what was trained and came out of the culture of Western Europe. And there seemed to be something to that, because how do we teach our children the things? I'm not a parent, but how was I taught by my parents, and how do I see my friends and their kids? They teach their children about when they can acquire things and not acquire things. And then it's that really key difference. The key way that children are taught is how not to acquire something. Mm-hmm. whereas everything else is how to acquire something in the animal kingdom. And there are a lot of different practices among non-humans about how to acquire things that get socially taught. Cowbirds get socially taught songs that they determine can't be done genetically, so they're socially taught it. And orcas would teach their progeny how to capture food, but we teach them how not to say something. We say no when you grab something that is somebody else's. Or I just discovered from a friend this great British children's cartoon called Bing, where there's a story called Not Yours, where the rabbit learns from his care how not to pick a lollipop out of the store and just take it home and lick it. What's curious is that Bing doesn't have to be taught that finding things, he calls them a mine. Like Flop asked him, so what do you have there? How did you get it? It's mine. I found it. That doesn't have to be taught out of this. What you're taught is how you can and cannot go about acquiring things to say, this is mine. And that's what we teach our children. So it has this element of being customary. But I think where the humanities people go wrong is to assume that there isn't some element of that's universal among all humans. And that, I would argue, is in tools, utensils, and ornaments. That many anthropologists have found that in every human society, you can claim some tools by some people. It can be very limited number of people, very limited number of things, but there are some things that some people can say, this is mine, and they generally involve tools. So that is, I think, the starting point to understand and try to get this difference between humans and all the non-humans. That it is something about tools. And it's in tools that we see something very interesting in our primate cousins. So, tool use, again, is also both genetically and socially transmitted in the animal kingdom. Digger wasps will use pebbles. Ants use leaves to carry water. Badgers will use tree matter and things to cover up holes. So lots of animals use tools. But what's interesting about primates is that they are socially taught how to use tools. Chimpanzees and capuchin monkeys aren't born knowing how to use a hammer and anvil stones to crack open a nut. They have to learn it. So they're learning it. So that's the cultural part that I thought was interesting, that now we got tools and we've got a relative that has to teach it socially, that we have maybe the beginnings here in understanding how we deal with this thing called property, this custom.
Right. That's interesting. I want to talk a little bit more about the role of tools in defining what actually property means, because it seems that, well, from the beginning of time, animals have been using tools. And you talk a little bit about how tools are kind of extensions of ourselves. And when we use something, it's sort of like we put ourselves into the tool. And somehow that tool, ownership over that tool, defines our property in that tool. Can you talk a little bit more about what the meaning of property in something, in a tool?
So there's something interesting about why we have to use tools. It's because our physical body can't do it itself for whatever reason. And so let me take another example from chimpanzees. So chimpanzees will use a big wooden stick to poke a termite hill to get inside and find that chamber where the termites are. And when they find it, they will substitute out a slender reed. So I just met this field primatologist, Cricket Sands, and her co-authors looked at this and noticed that they switch out the tools when they feel the chamber. The interesting part is that they can feel the chamber from the other side of that wooden stick. So somehow they feel that, even though what they're really feeling in their body is the handle of the stick in their palm. So it's become a part of them. Now, that I think is the beginning. And we have the same we can do the same exercise ourselves. If we have a cane and we tap around and we feel the leg of the table through the cane. Like we are in the cane at that moment. Our mind has reorganized our perceptions so that we feel through the cane. So that is the beginning point, and it seems like chimpanzees have that too. Here's the cool part for humans. If I put that cane down, am I still in it?
Mm-hmm.
I would argue we are. And so at some point, we've got this symbolic way of thinking about the world that we've changed that very thing such that we are part of it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's a great pronoun that gets to that. So again, other animals like elephants and chimpanzees, if they look in a mirror, they can recognize themselves. In a sense, there's a concept of I. And it's in this physical body that they're seeing in the mirror. And wherever that physical body goes, I go with it. Well, all humans have the ability to say, this thing is mine. And what I propose is that mine is the concept in things. Mm-hmm. So somehow I became a mind when it deals with things not part of my physical body.
It's an extension of
it. It's an extension of me. But it's not the same thing. And what's interesting is that linguists cannot define mind in terms of I and I's in terms of mind. Those seem to be semantically primitive concepts and distinct, and for my purposes, universal among all humans. So we all can do this, and I'll think about it this way.
Okay. So we don't really think about owning property. I mean, people often say, I own this property. They don't think of themselves as being in the property, right? So how is this kind of just a semantic difference, these prepositions, I have property over something or of something, or I own a property, or I have property in something? Are we just talking about just kind of, moderate differences in the way we use language, or do these things have conceptual differences in the way we think about the term and what it actually means?
So property is a complex concept, and it's only relatively recently where we have called the thing itself property. Generally, property was this abstract concept out there, and things were things, not the thing itself. And at some point in our language, we've just cut off the shortcut and called the thing itself property. So we need to break down what property means or what it means to own some things. And that's where I think this concept of mind gets very useful. I think one of the elements of owning or calling something property is to say, I can say this thing is mine. But it doesn't just me saying it. There's got to be another component that other people in the world can know that what I say is true. Right. In other words, they understand it. And now you see where the custom is coming in there, that this is how we go about our daily lives, how we expect that if I make a spear, this is mine, and that I'm still in it when I lay it down and I take a nap.
Right.
And I think there's one other key component of that, and that is that other people cannot say, this is mine. Mm-hmm. Something about mine is singular, that it belongs, it's only one person that has this kind of sense of mine. Otherwise, mine doesn't work. Mm-hmm. So I think I've come to respect the power of language in a way that, for me, saying just as semantics is actually a window to how we think about the problem. And that those words that we choose are reflecting how we organize, the mind is organizing the world. Mm-hmm. And so that's where I think, also looking at language, I've found evidence of how this containment process of being in the thing is evident. That comes up kind of over and over in different places over time, and seems to confirm it. But ultimately, there's an empirical test of this. You can look at cases in property disputes and say, well, does this inness seem to explain our intuitions? And that's kind of where I've headed.
Oh, fantastic. You actually have added this interesting angle of experimental economics to test our theories of how we actually cognize this concept. What do we think is property? Are we actually in the property? And you say that it is a social construct in a way, right? All the other people in society have to also recognize kind of my inness in a object, yes. Right? So tell us a little bit more about how you actually tested this.
Well, so I started by looking at several cases in Anglo-American law about lost and found things, and because now there's a thing out there. When it's a created object, we tend to have this intuition that somebody must be able to call this thing mine. But if they're not around, we want to give it to somebody else to use and call it mine. But how do we do that? So all these different cases have these kind of circumstances. I would argue this idea of inness kind of explains our basic intuitions around them. So, I'll just give I'll give a strong case and then also some weaker ones. But the strong case is what I built my experiment around. Mm-hmm. If it's going to work, it's got to work here. If it fails at that point, well, then I need to revisit things.
Yeah.
So we start the case. It's pretty strong. I think our intuitions go with with my theory. So it's a case from, I believe it's 1877, Durfee v. Jones. Durfee owns a safe. He bails it to Jones to sell for him and says, you can use the safe while you're trying to sell it for me. Durfee offered to sell it to him, but Jones said no. So it's very clear that Durfee owns it and Jones is the bailee. And while Jones is using the safe, he goes inside the safe, inside the wall, there's some money that is not put there by Durfee. So it's prior to Durfee, so that owner we can't find anymore. So now, who has property in that money? Mm. Durfee, who owns the safe, or Jones, who has it in his possession and found it, the money. Mm-hmm. And a couple of psychologists, Peter DeSholi and Rachel Karpov, I believe, asked people, just kind of did a mechanical Turk test for 20 cents. Okay, who do you think gets this? Here are the details of the case. And 80% of the people said it was the owner of the safe, Durfee. Not the one who found it, and not the one who had money in their possession at the time, the safe in their possession. Mm-hmm. So, but the judge rules for the finder and the one who had in possession, because that seems to be the prior precedent. Mm-hmm. But our intuitions go this other way. So this seems, all right, my intuitions are, this has got inness in a double sense. Inside the safe, inside the wall. It's like the money is a part of the safe itself.
Right.
That's why we say, Durfee. Well, let's put that to the test with some real money on the line. Mm-hmm. Much bigger stakes, but also for people deciding it, that they're making the case like a judge does for actual real people. So I created my first three-dimensional first-person experiment. So it's kind of like those shooter games. You're in the world. If I'm saying in this is important, I want that to be part of the experience. Mm-hmm. And there's a red person and a blue person. And the red person picks up a box and is given a task to sort tokens inside of it. So think of it as their box, their task. They give it to blue to wash for them and then to sell. And then blue gets to keep some of that money for themselves for having done that for them. And it's described to them as red owns the box. They're passing this along. And they'll do this several rounds, 5 rounds. And at the end of those 5 rounds, they both have the same amount of money from doing the tasks of sorting and the other one selling the box. They have the same amount of money, so they're in equal positions in that sense. Then, on the last 6th round, proceeds exactly the same, but all of a sudden when the blue person is selling the box, sets the box down and another token falls out. One they haven't seen before. This one is worth $25. All the other tokens worth 50 cents. This one is $25. And the robot in the world asks blue, there's a purple token in red's box. Is it yours or is it red's? And blue has to answer, pick one of it. Whatever they choose, the robot then goes over and asks the red person, there was a purple token in your box. Is it yours or is it Blue's? And so now we get this in how, unlike a case, we get a chance to see how many times there's actual conflict. Cases are special. Whatever they got to, they got into conflict. So the other part of this experiment is that there are 3 other people who are watching the entire 3D world the entire time, who are then asked, they're called observers, and they said, all right, Blue said there was a purple token in Red's box. Blue says it is theirs or not. Red says it is theirs or not. They've seen those two claims. Your job, as the 3 of you, is to decide who actually gets the purple token. And like a judge, I incentivize them to think, what is the rule that is out there that I should be implementing, by saying that if you are in the majority position, so if one other person agrees with you or both people agree with you, you get $20. But if you're in the minority, you get nothing. So it can't be just how I want to go. I have to think about how other people are thinking about the problem. Mm-hmm. And so by asking them that, we then award it by those panels. And first of all, we find that only in a third of the cases, there's actually no conflict. Either Red wants it and Blue doesn't, or Blue says it's not there. Blue says it's theirs, or Red says it's not. I think there's one case where neither one claimed it. Mm-hmm. But that's interesting, that there's fair amount of conflict. And when there's no conflict, the observers give it to the person who said it was theirs and the other person who said it was not. Mm-hmm. They say, we don't give it to them. So they don't, and that's equal, they're equal number, Reds wanting it, Blues didn't, Blues wanting it, and Reds didn't. And so they always give it to that. So that's interesting. So people don't come up with a rule unless they have to come up with a rule, which seems useful to society.
Yeah.
But then there's 2/3 where there is conflict. And 77% of the panels, 3-person panels, award it to Red, the person who owns the box. So this seems to confirm what there was for the psychologists were asking people. Here's some real stakes. I've had a larger pop, so there's 200 people going through this experiment between observers and Red and Blue agents. So it seems, all right, I got it. Now I got to see, I need to ask the counterfactual question. What if now it's not Red's box, but it's Blue's box? Mm-hmm. So the entire experiment is exactly the same, except they tell them it's Blue's box. But actions are all around the thing. What is my idea? What is my prediction? My prediction is that they're going to give it to Blue now. It's going to switch to Red. What happens? Well, there are only 50% of the cases there are actually conflicts. So that seems to go, conflict goes down. And the same pattern, they don't change what the I can't call them litigants because they're not, the 2 agents are claiming. Mm-hmm. But 50% of the cases, they still have a conflict, and they still give it to Red 70% of the time. So I'm like, whoa, they're giving it to Red, even if I call it Blue's box. So either I'm wrong, that this whole idea is something else is going on in here, but that seems odd because when it's called Red's box, so either it's not mattering who I give it to, like, okay, well, what about the experiment means it's not mattering? Well, the way the experiment is set up is Red goes to the dispenser to get a box. They're the first one to touch the box in the world. And they carry it over, do their thing, and pass it off to Blue. I said, well, maybe it's not mattering what I tell them who the owner is. It's mattering what's actually happening in the world, because they're observers and they're watching us. So I change it, one more change. Now Blue owns the box and picks up the box from the dispenser. Yeah. Goes and washes it, then they do the sorting. They go the same process, same amount of money, but now Blue is the first person to pick it up and touch it. What happens? 100% of the conflicts, they award it to Blue. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So it's even stronger than I thought. That it's not me telling them that they own it. It's the physical connection between the person and the thing that is what is driving their awarding the found token to. So I take that as strong evidence. Now I got to break it, and there are many other cases that are less strong with the inness of the case that I can pursue. But I think I have a hint, and I have a platform, and I can keep testing it and see where I break and where I'm wrong.
So there's this interesting connection about you having to actually touch something that's yours. This physicality is very critical to property because that's kind of how you transfer yourself into the object, right? So even if the red was picking up blue's box, and we know it was blue's box, and red gave it to blue, people would still think that red is the rightful owner of that token that was found. It's just because he was the first one with his hands on it.
Yes.
That's interesting. So it's not even about your claims to ownership as much as what people think, who was the first one to get there, to have it, to kind of put their hands on it, right?
Well, in that sense, the experiment is, because the observers are watching the whole thing, that they have that. They have that third person view of it. Now, if in a court case, they don't get to do that. They have to be told that, and maybe they start believing that when... But I put that at odds here. They could believe me, or they can make their own opinion, and the juries make their own opinions.
Yeah.
It's a great thing about the process.
Yeah, that's true.
It gives it to the people for how they think about it, not to the prosecutor or the defense.
Yeah, true. So what is... how does this sort of impact the way we think about property in the social sciences, right? If we know that there's some kind of physicality involved in it, or at least this is the way society perceives property. And it's a lot about kind of finders keepers, people being the first to get to an object. How does that change anything about how we study property, about what it means for economic outcomes?
Well, I think the first part is that it's property carries this moral force with it. When I say this is mine, that's not just a factual claim. It means that if you go up, pick it up, and walk off with it, I'm saying something that is morally going on in the world, that you ought to return this thing, that I have been harmed by that. And it is an interaction between me and the entire community about deciding when I can and cannot do that. I think the way we tend to think about property economics is it's a constraint imposed on us by the outside world, and it goes one direction. Those are the world. That's how property works, and I kind of maximize and go about my life responding to that as a constraint. Whereas I think it's a little looser because it's also going the other way. That every time I make this claim, and the rest of the community has to decide if it's true or not, we're deciding how the rules work. And so it's a two-way conversation that is, I think, lost in how we think about it in economics. We just take it for granted as a constraint, where maybe it's endogenous to the system, or when we can and cannot make these claims. And that... so I think that's the first point. And then how we decide these rules, the part that is, I believe, biological in us is how our brains work in order to do this in this thing. That comes with the biology of our brains, and that gets passed on. But there's this other social part, script, that gets put on top of that system. And it's the interaction of those two where I think there's a lot of room to understand how that works. I think it gives us plenty of opportunity to work with, say, people in the humanities to understand how mind, if they're suspect of it, can actually promote the social good.
Right.
And can it make for better lives that is not about theft, as Proudhon said. Property is theft.
Right.
No, that the property settles disputes. It comes about as a way to keep us from fighting. If you couldn't say this is mine and that is yours, then we're going to fight for deciding that this is mine.
Right.
And that's worse for everyone. And so I think what this adds is another way for us as social scientists to think about property and to begin to talk to people in the humanities and biology about how we think about these problems. I think it gives us something new to think about.
Right, that's very important. I think that, in development economics, we often say, well, in order to promote good economic development, you need to give people property rights, right? Just as if, they kind of fall out of the sky, right? It's often, we often say, well, yes, all economists know this, but then suddenly when you try to impose these kind of institutions in places where they've never existed before, it's like suddenly just everything is chaos and nothing really works.
Do you have an example? I'd love to hear that, of an example of where it's been imposed and it didn't work.
I'm not really sure of an exact paper at the moment, but I was actually thinking about the fall of communism in 1989, where the wisdom at the time in the West was you should launch a set of prepackaged economic reforms to help countries transition from state ownership of production to private ownership. And of course, it's now common knowledge that that advice was misguided because it missed out on this plethora of cultural and political factors that actually weren't also transitioning. And as a result, you had economic reforms taking place in a legal vacuum, and many state resources were simply pilfered and sold off to the powerful, leaving much of civil society behind. But even going off of this example, I wanted to interrogate this idea of property rights further. We know that there is obviously some folly and hubris in trying to impose rights from above or from the quote-unquote West. But at the same time, can't we think of rights as sets of rules to govern our claims to property? And if that is the case, can't those rules actually emerge from below? Can't communities themselves assign property rights? Or does the language of rights always have to come from above?
Well, so part of why I got into this project was when I started an experiment with my co-authors, Vernon Smith and Eric Kimbrough, probably over 12, 13 years ago. And we set up an experiment where people could specialize and trade things, but we just took out the possibility that you can't protect what's in your own field in your own house in the experiment. And it was wild, crazy. Things are flying all over the screen. And these are with Western educated industrial students, and yet they're rich, and yet in this virtual world, it's all craziness. And so we were kind of surprised, and everything we tried to do to kind of promote it, what we gave them, failed. And so I started reading about, let's read some of these people that are known in political theorists talk about all the time, property, Locke, Hume. And I noticed they don't use the term property rights. And a simple Google engram of property rights shows you that the word property right and property rights doesn't pick up until the late 1800s. 1875 is when it starts to build. And so property rights is a new word, new concept. And how do we use it and define it? Now, you used it defined it in a way that most people don't. Only a couple that I know. You define it as a rule. But most economists, if you ask them how to define a property right, they'll say it is a right to use or something like that. But they'll define a property right in terms of the word right.
Right.
Which doesn't really help us. And so I'm not convinced we need that word. We use rights. Again, I think this is a very Western European concept, particularly Anglo, I would argue. This notion, I have a right to speedy trial, free speech, things like that. And it adds additional moral force to this concept of property.
Right.
But do we need that actual moral force? I'm not sure. I'm not convinced. And here's this is probably the most speculative thing that I've been part of. But what's the preposition that follows right? It's always to. Now it can be an infinitive, so it can be a particle as well too. But it's to, which means it's pointing. So when we say property right to your crops or property right to use the horse or whatever, we're saying there's a right out here and it's pointing over to the thing over here. what's out hanging out here? Where is it coming from? Where is it? Why is it being pointing to this thing? Whereas if you think about it this in way, property in the way, which is how Locke talks about it, which is how the prior 100 years of elite British jurisprudence talked about it. They have property in the swans. That's just the thing itself inside it. I'm pointing to a glass, but
right.
you can't see that. It's and so the inness goes with the thing itself, and property right kind of means it's hanging out there and gives us a sense that we have this freedom to construct it however we wish to desire it to be. And so I'm not convinced that we need that right, in part because we want to get rid of the customary way of thinking about it. That seems to go away, and that I think that's part of the reason why people are suspect of it, that they don't think of this as the ordinary way that ordinary people think about preventively settling conflicts.
Right.
And so in rights tends to think about coming from imposed from above, and I want to recapture that appreciation of the marvel of it being how ordinary people think about these issues and solve disputes and settle them even before they happen.
That strikes me as quite a contentious point, just thinking back to the Declaration of Independence and those lines about you having inalienable rights to property, and that was changed to the pursuit of happiness. But do we actually have to disqualify the concept of rights, not only over property, but perhaps over other things, if we take your approach?
A next version of this project might be to discover how rights themselves and the way of thinking about this is a custom itself. How we think about people and how we treat those people is also itself a custom that has evolved over time. We haven't always treated people the same way. In fact, even when the Constitution was written, men only meant white property-owning men.
Right.
And now it means
a
broader. And so, so I think right is just as customary as I'm arguing property is. But I want us to think about why and where it's coming from, and ultimately it's coming from us. We are the ones thinking about other people and how to treat other people and other things, and that it is in that sense, I think human is right. It's a human invention to think about rights, to think about property. And I think that should be something the humanists want to hear. That this is about us as being human, that we do these kind of things, and we have the power to think about the world differently. Whereas if you think of it as inalienable, like it's unquestionable, it's that how can you even not think about that? Whereas I think we need to ask those questions, and that's where we need the humanities to think about those. I think the problem in humanities, they want to go too far, and anything they don't like mine, they're going to call that evil.
Right.
And so this is a place. It's contentious. My thoughts aren't all worked out on this. I'm still writing the book. And I'm sticking with property, but I think there's something to be done with rights and where we go and how we think about them. But I'll say one last thing. Part of it also is I want to get at the part that is kind of common to all human beings. And if the concept of rights is extremely complicated and culturally conveys meaning in a way that it doesn't in other languages, then how do we draft international documents to deal with people? We got to put them in terms that all people can identify with. And if we use these particularly Western Anglo ones, I think we're missing out missing the universality that we're really aiming for. And there are these kind of core concepts that we can universally use across languages and people to talk about those type of issues. Like, it is bad if people do bad things to other people. Now, how you define bad, but that's the universal precept that we can carry with us. What rights are designed to protect? There's an ambiguity going on there, particularly how it applies to all humans. That I'm interested in that to universalize how we understand economics, how we understand property, and these issues, because we tend to think about it from a very Western, educated, industrialized, rich democracies.
I think that's a really deep point, and perhaps another way of looking at the benefits of this very bottom-up and human-centric way of looking at property is precisely to recognize that it also changes over time. And I was just thinking of the concept of marriage, and that traditionally you would ask for somebody's hand, or we still say these things, but one could have presumed that the father basically hands off the daughter to the husband as a form of property. And obviously, we don't think about marriage in this way anymore, and that's obviously for the best. So it seems like we actually are developing this way of getting better over time, that human societies change and evolve, and that's really for our benefit.
Well, and I think that raises the question, why are we becoming more ethical in how we treat people over time? I think it is important that to see that it has evolved, and then they ask the question, why is it evolving? Which is a big question. I think Deirdre McCloskey is tackling that. She's arguing that it's commerce, it's the commercial way of life that is actually making us better ethical people. And I think that's a big question. How does that work? But I think you're exactly right. Understanding that it does evolve and does change is huge. And it's easy to kind of get lost in our moment right now and not see that, particularly now in a world where things seem to be not very pleasant and good. But yet, think about 50 years ago, things have evolved a lot since then. The fear is, are we going to slip back? We never know. But why haven't we yet?
And perhaps that's another point at which you can connect with your colleagues in the humanities, and that actually, well, we did have these egregious notions of property in the past, what with slavery and these outdated notions of marriage. And actually, you just say, well, we have this proven track record of getting better, and the reasons for that are really fascinating.
As an economist, I will say it has something to do about what we're studying. I think it has something to do with the commerce and in the world, and for the better, not necessarily assuming for the worst.
I also wanted to touch base on your methodology and the role that interdisciplinarity plays in your work. You've obviously consulted a lot of different fields, from biology to psychology to economics, and I wonder, is that sort of bringing together of different fields productive for your work, or does it actually make things more difficult?
Well, so I'm a colleague and a student of Vernon Smith, and he always advised to read broadly, work narrowly. And so this project is following that maxim. I got interested in linguistics right after I got tenure, started reading about it. I'm trying to understand the connections between exchanging of ideas and thoughts with exchanging things. And it's taken me now, it's 2018, 13 years later, I'm actually putting together into a book. But I think it gives us ideas that I wouldn't have normally got just by studying economics or keeping within the narrow literature of economics. So reading broadly gives you new ideas. As Matt Ridley says, ideas can have sex, and that, I think, is the benefit of it. you have to, there is an element of self-discipline you need in order to kind of keep those ideas manageable, which is the kind of the premise of your question. And that there are many, this book does not go through all the paths I went through that didn't go anywhere. You only see the ones that went somewhere where I put them together. So yes, it's messy in that sense. But I think it keeps you more nimble too. It does come at the expense of becoming specialized. My reading of econometrica has gone down.
Maybe for the better.
No, I had a huge history of econometric issues from grad school, and but it's something. It's different, and for me, that's the fun of it. Also, trying to learn these different fields. It's good to find people. So I work with a primatologist. So my work in biology, I get to ask them my questions, go to some of their small conferences, and ask them on the way to dinner. Well, what do you think about baboons and their herons? And just to press those ideas to make sure that I'm not, going off on a wrong tangent.
Yeah.
But inevitably, I'm going to make some mistakes, and I think I'm going to be some prone to that. But that's part of the process of discovery.
Fantastic. Great way to end the conversation. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, thank you for having me. I had a great visit.
Fantastic. To all of our listeners, we hope you've enjoyed this conversation with us today. You'll be able to find more podcasts, live talks, seminars, and blogs on the cutting-edge debates in governance directly on our website, csgs.kcl.ac.uk. You can also follow us on Twitter and Facebook at CSGSKCL. We look forward to seeing you again soon on the Governance Podcast.